The wind was sharp that morning in northern Arizona. Dry sagebrush rolled like tumbleweeds across the cracked red earth, and the gray clouds above gave the desert a colder silence than usual. Roy Thatcher stood still beside his palomino horse, Dusty, brushing a gloved hand across his worn-out denim jacket. The old rancher squinted under the brim of his hat, eyes tracing the horizon like a man who'd spent a lifetime searching. But today felt different. Dusty had stopped without command, his ears perked forward, nostrils flaring as he faced something up ahead, something that didn't belong. Roy wasn't one to believe in signs, but after 6 months of searching for his missing grandson, Hank, hope came in small doses. The boy had vanished on a ride through these very canyons, and despite a full county search, there'd been no trace, not a hoof print, not a thread of clothing. Folks moved on, assumed the worst. But Roy never gave up. Hank was more than family. He was Roy's second chance at getting things right after losing his daughter. So when Dusty refused to move and instead veered toward an unfamiliar path, Roy tightened his grip on the reins and followed. Just beyond a dense patch of juniper, the earth opened in a jagged, narrow chasm, a deep cut in the land Roy swore had never been there before. It stretched for yards in both directions, like the desert had split open in defiance. Roy stepped closer, his boots kicking up the dusty edge. The air from the crack was cool and stale, carrying a scent of wet stone and something else he couldn't quite place. As he peered into the shadowy depth, something caught his eye, a piece of torn flannel, wedged in the rock. Red and black. Roy's breath caught. That was Hank's shirt. He reached down with trembling hands and pulled the cloth loose. It was real, worn, sun-bleached, but unmistakable. Dusty stood nearby, eyes locked on the abyss, shifting nervously. Roy's mind spun. Why here? Why now? He hadn't seen this path in decades. It led toward an old mining route that hadn't been touched since before Hank was born. No one went that way anymore. It wasn't on the modern maps. But Dusty had found it. Back at the ranch, Roy laid the flannel on his kitchen table beside yellowed maps and faded photographs. He traced old trails with his finger, piecing together memories he'd buried long ago. That forgotten mining trail. His father once warned him never to ride near it. Said some places weren't meant to be reopened. Roy hadn't thought about that in years, until now. Dusty, restless in the barn, let out a low snort as if urging Roy to move faster. The next morning, Roy returned to the chasm. Dusty led again, hooves steady along the brittle edge. After nearly an hour of riding, they came to a clearing Roy didn't remember, and there, half buried in brush and silence, stood the collapsed entrance of an old mine. Dusty stopped cold. Roy dismounted, heart pounding. The entrance looked like a doorway to the past, one he thought had been sealed forever. But as he stepped closer, he knew deep in his bones, this mine held answers. And maybe it hadn't taken Hank. Maybe it was hiding him. Do you want any adjustments to this version, or should I continue to Chapter 2? Roy stood before the collapsed mine entrance, heart thudding like a drumbeat in his chest. The wind had quieted, leaving only the sound of Dusty's restless breathing behind him. The wooden beams framing the mine were splintered and rotted, barely holding their shape. Faint markings on one of the support posts caught Roy's attention. Old initials carved into the wood, RT+EW. His stomach turned. He had carved that as a teenager, back when he and Elsie Wheeler would sneak out here during long summer nights, dreaming of futures that never came. He hadn't seen those letters in over 50 years. The mine, long forgotten by most, had a reputation when Roy was a boy. Some said it was cursed, a place where men went in and didn't come out. Others claimed it was just dangerous, nothing more than a collapsed silver vein not worth reopening. But as he stared into the gaping shadow, Roy felt something he couldn't explain. The piece of Hank's shirt, Dusty's behavior, the forgotten trail. None of it was coincidence. He knelt near the opening, brushing away dead leaves and rocks. A subtle draft escaped from inside, colder than the desert air, carrying a smell of damp earth and rusted iron. He hesitated. At his age, entering a decaying mine alone wasn't just foolish, it could be fatal. But the memory of Hank's laugh, the way he used to race Dusty across the plains, wouldn't let him walk away. Roy tied Dusty to a nearby mesquite tree and retrieved an old lantern from his saddlebag. With a flick of the match, the flame flickered to life, casting a faint glow. He stepped inside slowly, careful not to disturb the unstable structure. Each step echoed, dust rising around his boots, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. Inside, the walls narrowed quickly. Old mining tools lay scattered in the dirt, rusted shovels, a collapsed rail line, a broken helmet. Roy's light caught on something farther in. A boot print. Fresh. The dust had been disturbed recently. His breath caught. Someone had been down here, not weeks ago, but days, maybe hours. He crouched, examining the shape. It was smaller than his, like Hank's size. The deeper he walked, the more uneasy he felt, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Faint whispers seemed to echo through the corridors, or perhaps it was just his mind playing tricks. Suddenly, a noise, a sharp clatter of rock deeper in the tunnel. Roy froze. He raised the lantern, but the darkness beyond swallowed the light. "Hank?" he called, his voice rough and uncertain. No reply. Just silence, and then another sound, softer, like fabric brushing stone. He stepped forward, carefully, his heart racing. The mine curved slightly to the left, and as he rounded the bend, something on the wall caught his eye, a message scrawled in charcoal, "Don't trust him." Roy staggered back. The writing was recent. His hands shook as he lowered the lantern. Whoever left that message had been here. And they weren't alone. "Do you want any changes to this chapter, or should I move on to chapter 3? Roy stared at the message etched in charcoal, "Don't trust him." The letters were shaky, as if written in a rush or by someone barely holding it together. His mind reeled. Who was him? And who left the warning? The mine grew colder the longer he stood there, the silence pressing in like the weight of the mountain itself. Roy raised the lantern again, scanning the surrounding walls. His pulse pounded in his ears. Something wasn't right. He had walked into this place searching for a trace of Hank, but now it felt like Hank wasn't the only one who had something to hide. He turned and followed the faint boot prints deeper into the tunnel. They led to a small chamber that opened like a hidden pocket in the earth. The air was thick with dust and dampness. In the corner, near a collapsed timber support, was a rusted tin box half buried in the dirt. Roy knelt slowly, knees creaking, and pulled it free. The lid gave with a groan of rust, revealing what looked like old photographs, newspaper clippings, and a folded leather journal. He wiped the grime from the top photo and froze. It was a picture of his daughter Mary Beth, smiling beside a younger man Roy didn't recognize. Behind them stood the very mine he was now inside. He sank onto a nearby rock, breath caught in his throat. The photo was dated 25 years ago. That didn't make sense. Mary Beth never told him she'd come out here. And who was the man beside her? As he flipped through the journal, names began to appear. Some were familiar. Old ranchers, miners from decades back. But one name kept surfacing again and again, underlined in angry strokes. Caleb Hargrove. Roy hadn't heard that name in years. Caleb had worked with his father in the 60s, a hard man with a sharper tongue. He'd disappeared after a land dispute, and no one in town had seen him since. Roy's gut tightened. Was Caleb connected to Hank's disappearance? To Mary Beth's past? He folded the journal carefully and tucked it into his coat. A sudden gust of air swept through the chamber, blowing out his lantern and plunging him into pitch black. Panic hit like a hammer. He fumbled for his matches, hands trembling, until the flame finally returned. Shadows danced on the walls. That's when he saw it, more writing, scrawled just beneath the first message. Smaller, fainter, as if written by a child, "He's still here." A chill ran down Roy's spine. Every hair on his body stood on end. He backed out of the chamber, lantern swinging wildly. Dusty's soft whinny echoed from outside the mine, distant but grounding. Roy followed the path back with shaky steps, clinging to the light like it was life itself. As he emerged into the daylight, the air hit him like a wave of truth. He looked back at the mine's dark mouth, breathing hard. Roy knew now, Hank had stumbled into something far older and deeper than just getting lost. And someone didn't want the truth coming out. Shall I move forward with Chapter 4, or would you like to make any adjustments? Back at the ranch, Roy laid the journal on his kitchen table like it was something fragile, something that might shatter if opened too quickly. Dusty stood just outside the window, quietly grazing, calm as ever. But Roy's hands were anything but steady. He poured himself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and stared at the photo again. Mary Beth with that man. Caleb Hargrove. Why had she never mentioned him? And why would her name be tied to a place she swore she never stepped foot in? Roy ran a calloused hand over his face. Something was buried deeper than the mine, and it wasn't just ore. Flipping through the pages of the journal again, Roy found entries in two distinct handwritings. One was harsh, angry, clearly Caleb's. The other was smoother, careful. Mary Beth. She'd written about dreams she'd been having, memories she couldn't explain. Nightmares of someone calling her from deep underground. "I feel like I'm standing in two lives at once," she wrote. "One I remember, one I buried." Roy's throat tightened as he read her words. She had been keeping this pain hidden, maybe even from herself. And now Hank was gone, caught in the same tangle. Roy needed answers, and there was only one person still alive who might have them. Sheriff Wade Kinney. He'd been around back when Caleb vanished. Roy saddled Dusty and rode into town, his eyes heavy with questions. When he arrived at the sheriff's office, Kinney looked up from behind his desk, surprised. "Didn't expect to see you again, Roy," he said, voice low. "Especially not asking about old ghosts." Roy dropped the journal on his desk. "You know that name, don't you? Caleb Hargrove." Kinney's face stiffened. His jaw clenched. "You should let this lie. That mine's been dead for decades. No good ever came out of it." But Roy pressed. "My grandson may be alive, Wade. And that mine is breathing again." After a long pause, Kinney finally stood and walked to the window. Caleb didn't disappear. He went underground, literally. Said there were things in that mine worth more than silver. Secrets. History. Whatever he found down there, it scared the hell out of him. Roy's voice was sharp. "Then why didn't you stop him?" "I tried," Kinney said, turning back. "But your daughter." Mary Beth was already tangled up in it. She and Caleb were close for a while. Too close. He told her things, filled her head with ideas. Then she broke it off. Said she saw something down there she couldn't forget. As Roy left the office, the sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the dirt road. The truth wasn't just buried underground, it was tied to his own bloodline. Mary Beth, Caleb, now Hank, all connected to that mine. That message, "Don't trust him," echoed again in Roy's mind. And suddenly, one terrifying thought clawed its way in. What if Hank wasn't the only one still down there? Ready for Chapter 5, or do you want any changes? Roy didn't sleep that night. He sat on the front porch of the ranch house, journal in hand, staring at the horizon as if it might offer him some kind of sign. Dusty paced restlessly in his pen, sensing the weight in the air. The desert was unusually quiet. No coyotes, no wind, not even the hum of insects. Roy's mind turned over Wade Kinney's words again and again. She saw something down there she couldn't forget. What had Mary Beth witnessed in that mine? And what had Caleb Hargrove stirred up that was now threatening to take Hank? At first light, Roy packed his gear, extra lanterns, rope, water, and a revolver he hadn't touched in years. He wasn't going in blind this time. As Dusty trotted along the familiar trail, Roy felt the landscape shift. The air grew denser the closer they got to the mine, like the earth itself was holding its breath. When they arrived, Roy paused. The mine looked darker than before, like its shadow had grown thicker overnight. But he didn't hesitate. He tied Dusty to a post, lit his lantern, and stepped inside once more, this time with purpose. The deeper Roy went, the colder it became. The wooden beams groaned softly as if the mine remembered him. He passed the chamber where he'd found the journal, but instead of stopping, he kept going. He followed the old mining rails, now twisted and broken, until he came to a set of wooden stairs descending into the lower shaft. He hadn't noticed them before. The boards creaked under his weight as he descended, each step carrying him further into a darkness that felt almost alive. At the bottom, the tunnel widened into a space carved roughly into the rock, not part of the original mine. It looked like someone had dug it out by hand. Strange markings covered the walls, some resembling symbols, others just desperate scratches. And there, in the far corner, Roy found something that stopped him cold, a makeshift campsite. A sleeping bag, a lantern, a water jug, and next to them, a worn-out denim jacket Roy would recognize anywhere. Hank's jacket. Roy dropped to one knee, hands trembling as he picked it up. It smelled faintly of sweat and dust, still fresh. Hank had been here. Maybe still was. On the wall behind the camp, written in black charcoal, were more words. He followed me down here. I can hear him breathing. Roy backed up slowly, eyes scanning the dark. The silence around him now felt predatory, oppressive. He wasn't alone. Something was watching. A sudden metallic clang echoed from deeper inside the tunnel, sharp and close. Roy spun, drawing his revolver, lantern shaking in his hand. He called out, "Hank? Is that you?" No answer. Just the echo of his voice bouncing back, twisted and thin. Another sound followed, a slow, dragging scrape against stone, like boots or something heavier being pulled along. And for the first time in years, Roy felt true fear. Something wasn't right. Something was still moving down here. Should I continue to Chapter 6, or do you want to make any adjustments? Roy's lantern flickered violently as the dragging sound grew louder. The flame inside danced like it, too, wanted to flee. He stood frozen, revolver aimed into the dark, breath held so tight it burned. Then, a voice, low, hoarse, and trembling, echoed from the far end of the shaft. "Help, please!" Roy's heart slammed against his ribs. It wasn't just any voice. It was Hank's. He stumbled forward, eyes wide, lantern held high. The sound had come from beyond the wall of collapsed debris. A narrow space remained, just enough for someone to slip through if they were desperate enough. Roy dropped to his knees and peered inside. "Hank? That you?" he called, his voice cracking. Silence followed, then another strained breath. "It's me, Grandpa. I can't move. I've been here days." Emotion crashed over Roy like a wave. He started pulling at the rocks, tossing aside heavy stones with bare hands. Dust filled his lungs, but he didn't stop. Sweat dripped from his brow, and his fingers bled, but he kept digging until a small opening appeared. There, behind the debris, was Hank. Pale, eyes sunken, body bruised and weak, but alive. Roy reached in, grabbing his hand. "I've got you, boy. I'm getting you out." Hank's grip was faint but steady. "Don't let him find me," he whispered. Roy froze. "Who?" he asked. Hank just shook his head. He's still down here. He brought me food. But he's not right, Grandpa. He talks to the mine. Says it listens. Roy's blood turned cold. He glanced back over his shoulder into the black tunnel behind him, suddenly aware of every creak, every distant echo. Working quickly, Roy widened the gap and pulled Hank through. The boy collapsed into his arms, legs too weak to hold him. "We have to go now," Roy said firmly, helping him to his feet. "Can you walk?" Hank nodded, barely. They began the long, slow journey back up the shaft, Roy supporting Hank with one arm, lantern leading the way. Every step echoed. The mine seemed to moan around them, as if it knew someone was escaping. As they neared the stairs, Roy heard it again. Movement. Slow. Deliberate. From the lower chamber they just left. They didn't look back. Roy forced Hank up the steps, every board groaning under their weight. Finally, they saw it, daylight. The faint glow from the entrance. Dusty was still there, stomping nervously. As they emerged into the open air, Roy turned and stared into the mine one last time. Then, just before the shadows swallowed the tunnel behind them, a figure appeared. Too tall, hunched, face obscured by darkness. Roy couldn't make out the details, only the silhouette. The figure didn't follow. It simply watched, then stepped backward into the dark, vanishing. Roy lifted Hank onto Dusty's back and climbed up behind him. "We're not done with this," he muttered under his breath. But for now, they rode away from the mine, with more questions than answers. "Should I move on to Chapter 7, or would you like any changes?" Roy rode hard through the desert, arms tight around Hank as Dusty galloped beneath them like he knew time was running out. The wind stung Roy's face, but he didn't care. Every few seconds, he glanced back, half expecting that shadowy figure to be following, silent and relentless. Hank slumped in the saddle, barely conscious, whispering things that didn't make sense. "He listens to the mine. He knows our names. He said we were chosen." Roy's jaw tightened. That mine hadn't just swallowed his grandson, it had tried to change him. Back at the ranch, Roy laid Hank on the couch and covered him with a wool blanket. His skin was cold, but his breathing had steadied. Roy lit the fire, poured water into a tin cup, and helped Hank sip. The boy's hands trembled. "I thought I was gonna die down there," he muttered. Roy nodded silently. "You're safe now, son. But I need to know, who was that man?" Hank hesitated, then said the name like it burned. "Caleb." Roy stepped back, blood draining from his face. "He's dead. He vanished 40 years ago." Hank looked up with hollow eyes. "Then something down there's wearing his face." Later that night, Roy opened the journal again. He read entries that suddenly made more sense. One described dreams of being underground, trapped, not alone. Another spoke of a voice in the dark that promised protection, for a price. Mary Beth had written, "He offered me something. Said the mine gives what the world takes away. But I told him no. And that's when he changed." Roy's hands trembled. Mary Beth had faced this same darkness, and kept it secret. Had she done it to protect Hank? Or had she known it would come for him anyway? Needing answers, Roy returned to town the next morning and found Ellen Winslow at the cafe. She'd known Mary Beth better than anyone. Over a cup of coffee, Roy asked the question that had been clawing at him. "What did she keep from me, Ellen?" Ellen's eyes welled up. She was scared, Roy. Said Caleb was into something dark. Not just old maps and legends. He believed that mine was alive, that it chose people. Roy leaned in. "What do you mean, chose people?" Ellen whispered. "He said it knew who walked above it. It waited for the bloodline." Roy left the cafe with a chill crawling up his spine. This wasn't just about gold or secrets. It was something deeper. Something tied to him, to Mary Beth, and now Hank. That night, he checked Hank's jacket again. Inside the inner lining was something hard. A small bone, carved with strange markings, and a name scratched into it, Bartlett. His own last name. The mine hadn't been after strangers. It had been after his family. And now, it had marked them. Roy held the bone tightly in his fist, staring into the fire as it flickered. This wasn't over. It had just begun. Shall I move on to Chapter 8, or would you like to change anything? The carved bone stayed in Roy's hand long after the fire died down. He couldn't stop staring at the name, Bartlett, etched into its surface. The markings weren't just random. They were deliberate, ancient, even. Not in any language Roy recognized, but they felt familiar, like something buried in the back of his memory. The weight of the bone felt wrong in his hand, too heavy for its size. And cold. Always cold. Like it didn't belong above ground. He wrapped it in an old cloth and locked it inside a toolbox beneath the floorboards. Whatever it was, it didn't belong in this house. The next morning, Hank was stronger, but his eyes stayed distant, haunted. He sat at the kitchen table wrapped in a blanket, barely touching his food. He kept saying, "I belong to the mine," Hank whispered. "That it had been waiting for me. That you knew why." Roy froze. "What do you mean I knew?" Hank shook his head slowly. He said the mine speaks through blood, that the ones who hear it are always drawn back. Roy tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had heard something once, when he was a boy, a voice in the mine calling his name. He'd run. But now, after all these years, it had found its way back. With Hank resting, Roy returned to town and searched the old county archives. In the back of the records office, buried in a box marked pre-1900 claims, he found a map older than anything he'd ever seen. It showed the mine not as a single tunnel, but as part of a vast underground network. Symbols lined the edges, symbols that matched the markings on the bone. And at the center, handwritten in faded ink, the Bartlett vein. Roy stared at the name in disbelief. The land had once belonged to his ancestors. The mine hadn't just chosen them, they'd opened it. He took the map to Sheriff Kinney. The old lawman didn't even blink when he saw the name. "I always knew there was more to it," Kinney said quietly. "Your grandfather warned folks about that place. Said it wasn't just or they were digging up. Said the earth started to change the men who worked there." Roy's voice was dry. "You knew this and still let my daughter near it?" Kinney looked away. "We thought it was dead. But maybe it just waited." Back at the ranch, Roy opened the journal one last time and found a final page he hadn't noticed before, tucked beneath the back cover. Mary Beth's handwriting. "If you're reading this, Dad, it means the mine woke up again. Hank's not the first. I wasn't either. It calls the ones with the name. You have to end it before it takes more." Roy felt the weight of generations settle on his shoulders. The mine wasn't just a place, it was a curse. And the only way to end it was to go back. Shall I continue with Chapter 9, or do you want any edits first? The wind howled through the canyon as Roy stood at the edge of the mine for what he knew would be the last time. The journal was tucked inside his coat, Mary Beth's final warning burning in the back of his mind. Dusty stomped nervously behind him, as if sensing the weight of what was about to happen. Roy turned to Hank, who sat weak but alert in the saddle, his face pale but determined. "You're staying here," Roy said firmly. "No matter what happens down there, you don't come after me." Hank opened his mouth to argue, but Roy raised a hand. "This ends with me." Lantern in one hand, revolver in the other, Roy stepped into the mouth of the mine for the third time. The darkness swallowed him instantly, but he walked without hesitation. The walls pulsed with an unnatural warmth, as if the mine were alive, breathing. Deeper he went, past the collapsed beams and twisted rails, past the remnants of Hank's camp. The carved bone, still in his coat pocket, seemed to vibrate slightly as he descended the old stairs into the forbidden lower shaft. The tunnel narrowed until it gave way to a vast chamber Roy hadn't seen before. Hidden behind a rockfall he now climbed over. What lay beyond stole the breath from his lungs. Dozens of bones, arranged in a spiral across the floor, each one marked with symbols like the one he carried. In the center stood a stone altar, blackened and cracked. Behind it, carved into the rock wall, was a name, Bartlett, gouged deep, almost violently. This wasn't a mine. It was a tomb, a shrine, a warning. From the shadows behind the altar, a figure stepped forward. Caleb Hargrove. But not the man Roy remembered. His skin was pale, stretched tight over hollow cheeks, his eyes black as coal. "You came," Caleb rasped. "Just like she said you would." Roy raised the revolver, but Caleb only laughed, a dry, sick sound. "You can't kill what the mine has claimed. It doesn't take people, it binds them." Roy stepped forward, fury rising. "You took my daughter. You tried to take my grandson." Caleb's grin widened. "I didn't take them, Roy. The mine called them. Just like it's calling you." Roy lit a fuse he'd packed from his ranch, homemade explosives from an old storage shed, and tossed the bag onto the altar. Caleb lunged forward, snarling, but Roy fired a shot that slowed him just enough. "You want my blood? Come get it," Roy growled. Then he turned and ran, lantern swinging wildly as the fuse hissed behind him. He didn't look back. The blast shook the ground as Roy dove out of the tunnel's mouth, covering his head. A wall of fire and smoke erupted behind him, and the mine collapsed in on itself with a deafening roar. Dusty reared and Hank shouted from the ridge, running toward his grandfather. Roy lay still, chest heaving. The mine was gone. Buried. But deep in the earth, something still whispered his name. Shall I continue to the final chapter, or do you want any edits first? The sun was rising over the ridge as Roy sat quietly on the porch, watching its golden light stretch across the desert. A week had passed since the mine collapsed, but the weight in his chest hadn't lifted. His hands were still scratched and raw, his legs sore from the run, but he was alive. Hank too. And the mine, at least the entrance, was sealed under tons of rock and ash. But Roy knew better than to believe it was truly gone. Some things don't die. They just sleep. Inside the house, Hank stirred in his bed. He'd been healing slowly, both in body and mind. The haunted look in his eyes had faded some, but not completely. Roy checked on him every hour. Not out of fear, but because he couldn't bear to lose him again. He'd already lost Mary Beth to that cursed place. The guilt lingered, bitter and quiet. He hadn't protected her from the legacy he never understood. She had faced the darkness alone. Now Roy understood what that meant. She didn't run. She made sure it ended with her son. And now, with Roy. That evening, Roy returned to the ruins of the mine one last time. Dusty stopped a good 20 yards back, refusing to go further. Roy didn't blame him. The air was still wrong here. Still too cold for the desert, too quiet for a canyon full of wind. The blast had left the landscape scarred. Charred rock, scorched trees, and a long, jagged crater where the entrance once stood. Roy knelt down and placed the carved bone, the one with Bartlett etched into it, at the base of a blackened boulder. Then he buried it with his bare hands. "No more," he whispered. "You've had enough of us." As the wind picked up, Roy swore he heard something faint, a breath or a voice, carried through the canyon. But he didn't look back. This time, he didn't need to. Whatever still lingered beneath the earth, it no longer had a claim on his family. Not while he was still breathing. And if it ever rose again, someone would be ready. Back at the ranch, Hank was sitting by the fire when Roy returned. He looked stronger now, backlit by the warm glow, his eyes clear. "You really think it's over?" he asked quietly. Roy sat beside him and stared into the flames. "Not sure something like that ever really ends," he said. "But it doesn't get to take anything else from us." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Later that night, as Roy turned in, he found something resting on the windowsill. A small, smooth stone carved with a single word, "Remember." He picked it up, heart pounding, and looked out into the night. The desert stretched quiet and endless before him. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was a goodbye. But Roy knew one thing. The mine was closed, and the bloodline was free.